It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you, thick and heavy, as the judge's booming voice sliced through the courtroom, mocking the young man before him with a cruel, dismissive laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. The teenager, thin and seemingly frail, stood stoically, his gaze fixed on some distant point, absorbing every scathing word, every snide remark about his attire, his apparent lack of experience, and the audacity of his plea. No one in that room, not the stone-faced bailiffs, not the whispering spectators, not even the judge himself, could have imagined the seismic shift about to occur, the profound revelation simmering beneath the surface of that quiet, unassuming young man. The air in Courtroom 3B was always thick with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and the faint, metallic tang of anxiety. Today, however, there was an added acrid note, the bitter aroma of judgment. Judge Caldwell, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an air of weary disdain, peered over his spectacles at the figure before him. "And what, pray tell," he droned, his voice dripping with condescension, "is this child doing attempting to represent anyone in my courtroom?" He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand towards the young man, barely out of his teens, who stood slender and unassuming at the defense table. This was Michael, a name that felt too common, too ordinary for the extraordinary weight he was attempting to shoulder. His dark, ill-fitting suit hung a little loose on his frame, a stark contrast to the tailored finery of the prosecution and the judge's own robes. Michael's client, an elderly woman named Mrs. Elena Petrova, sat beside him, her gnarled hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting between Michael and the formidable figure of Judge Caldwell. She was fighting to keep her small, independent bakery, a local institution threatened by a powerful, ruthless corporation. Mrs. Petrova had no money for a high-powered attorney. Michael, a law student interning at a pro bono clinic, was all she had. The judge's words were not just an attack on Michael, but a direct assault on Mrs. Petrova's last flicker of hope. A ripple of suppressed chuckles ran through the public gallery. Most of them were here for the spectacle, the anticipated dismantling of this inexperienced boy by the seasoned legal system. They saw only a naive youth, perhaps a little too ambitious for his own good. They didn't see the flicker of something else in Michael's eyes, a deeply embedded resilience, a quiet fire that had been stoked by a lifetime of injustice. Michael had known this would be difficult. He had spent countless nights poring over case law, rehearsing arguments in front of a cracked mirror, the weight of Mrs. Petrova's trust a palpable burden on his shoulders. He remembered her tear-filled eyes, the faint smell of yeast and vanilla that clung to her clothes, a scent that was the very essence of her life's work. He couldn't fail her, but the judge's mockery stung, a hot, unwelcome flush rising to his neck. It wasn't just the words. It was the casual cruelty, the dismissive air that suggested his very presence was an insult to the hallowed halls of justice. He thought of his own past, the times he had been overlooked, underestimated, discarded. A deep breath filled his lungs, a silent anchor in the storm of the judge's contempt. He had been taught that true strength wasn't about shouting the loudest, but about holding your ground when the world tried to push you down. And Michael, in his quiet way, was a master of holding his ground. Judge Caldwell, enjoying the momentary ripple of amusement he had created, leaned back in his plush leather chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "So, Michael," he enunciated the name with a theatrical flourish, "are you truly prepared to waste this court's valuable time with such youthful idealism?" His gaze swept across the courtroom, inviting the continued snickers. The prosecutor, Mr. Harrison, a man whose perfectly coiffed hair and expensive suit practically screamed success, offered a sympathetic, almost pitying smile to Michael. It was the kind of smile that said, "Don't worry, kid, it'll all be over soon." But Michael saw the shark behind the smile, the predator ready to capitalize on any perceived weakness. A profound silence descended once more as Michael finally spoke. His voice, though soft, carried an unexpected resonance, a quiet power that cut through the lingering echoes of the judge's derision. "Your Honor, he began, his eyes now fixed directly on Judge Caldwell. "My client, Mrs. Elena Petrova, has dedicated her entire life to her bakery. It is not merely a business. It is the culmination of generations of hard work, a beacon of community, and her only source of livelihood. To dismiss her plea as youthful idealism is to dismiss the very principles of justice this court claims to uphold." There is no trembling in his voice, no waver in his stance. Instead, a calm, unwavering conviction settled over him, a transformation unfolding before the eyes of the bewildered courtroom. The judge's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a seemingly inexperienced youth. Mr. Harrison, sensing a shift in the courtroom's energy, leaned forward slightly, a subtle frown creasing his brow. Michael continued, his voice gaining a quiet momentum. "While I may appear young, Your Honor, I assure you that my understanding of the law, and more importantly, of the human cost of injustice, is not diminished by my years. I am prepared to argue Mrs. Petrova's case with every fiber of my being, and I believe, with all due respect, that this court will ultimately find her cause to be not idealism, but undeniable right." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, not seeking approval, but commanding attention. A hush had fallen over the spectators, the earlier snickers replaced by a palpable curiosity. They were witnessing something unexpected, a quiet defiance that crackled in the air. The boy they had dismissed was suddenly different. Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. This wasn't the intimidated stammering he had anticipated. This young man spoke with a precision, a measured cadence that hinted at something deeper than mere academic knowledge. It was the rhythm of someone who understood not just the letter of the law, but its spirit, its profound human implications. Mr. Harrison, the prosecutor, straightened in his seat, a flicker of genuine interest, perhaps even concern, replacing his earlier condescension. He had seen enough trials to recognize when a seemingly weak opponent was about to surprise everyone. The murmurs in the gallery had died down completely. All eyes were on Michael, who now stood not as a meek supplicant, but as an unexpected challenger. "Very well, counsel," Judge Caldwell finally conceded, the word counsel delivered with a reluctant formality that belied his true feelings. "Proceed. But be warned, this court has no patience for theatrics or unsubstantiated claims." It was an attempt to regain control, to reassert his authority, but the subtle shift in his tone was not lost on the keen observers in the room. Michael nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his head. He then turned to Mrs. Petrova, offering her a reassuring smile that seemed to momentarily ease the deep lines of worry on her face. It was a silent promise, a shared understanding that he would fight for her with everything he had. What followed was a legal masterclass. Michael, with an astonishing clarity and depth of knowledge, began to dismantle the corporation's case piece by piece. He cited precedents with ease, his arguments flowing logically and compellingly. He spoke not just of contracts and property lines, but of the historical significance of Mrs. Petrova's bakery to the community, of the dozens of local families who relied on her for their daily bread, and of the fundamental unfairness of a powerful entity crushing a small, honest business. He presented evidence with a quiet confidence that belied his years, meticulously detailing every loophole, every predatory tactic employed by the corporation. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the scratching of pens from the court reporter and the occasional rustle as someone in the gallery shifted, utterly captivated. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a story unfolding, a David and Goliath tale playing out in real time, and the audience, initially cynical, found themselves unexpectedly rooting for David. Judge Caldwell, initially dismissive, found himself leaning forward, his brow furrowed in concentration, a look of genuine surprise slowly replacing his earlier disdain. The transformation in Judge Caldwell's demeanor was subtle but undeniable. His posture, initially slouched with an air of boredom, had straightened. His eyes, which had previously held only contempt, now glinted with a reluctant respect, perhaps even a flicker of awe. He interrupted Michael less, and when he did, his questions were no longer mocking but genuinely inquisitive, probing at the complexities of the legal points Michael was raising. Mr. Harrison, the seasoned prosecutor, was visibly flustered. He scribbled furiously on his notepad, exchanging increasingly anxious glances with his junior counsel. Michael was not just countering his arguments. He was anticipating them, dismantling them before they could even fully form. Michael's voice, though never loud, carried an authority that transcended his youthful appearance. He spoke of intricate land deeds, obscure zoning laws, and the historical precedents of adverse possession with an articulation that suggested decades of experience, not just a few years of study. He wove together the dry threads of legal fact with the emotional resonance of Mrs. Petrova's story, painting a picture not just of a legal dispute, but of a deeply human struggle. He spoke of the sweat and toil that had built the bakery, the laughter and tears that had echoed within its walls, the countless loaves of bread that had nourished the community. He reminded the court that behind every legal document lay a human life, a story, a dream. The court reporter, usually impassive, found herself pausing in her rapid typing, momentarily lost in the narrative Michael was constructing. Even the bailiffs, typically stoic and detached, found their gazes fixed on the young man, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary display unfolding before them. The public gallery was utterly still, every person hanging on Michael's every word. They had come for a predictable downfall, a quick dismissal, but they were witnessing a revelation. This wasn't just a law student. This was a force, a mind operating on a level far beyond his years, speaking with a wisdom that seemed to emanate from a source deeper than textbooks. Judge Caldwell, who had prided himself on his ability to read people, felt a creeping sense of unease mixed with burgeoning admiration. Who was this young man? He scanned Michael's face for any telltale sign, a flicker of nervousness, a moment of uncertainty, but found none. Only a calm, unwavering resolve. The atmosphere in Courtroom 3B had shifted from one of cynical amusement to stunned respect. Judge Caldwell's initial condescension had evaporated completely, replaced by a deep furrow in his brow and a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement as Michael concluded a particularly complex point on property rights. Mr. Harrison, the corporate lawyer, was no longer just flustered. He was clearly rattled, his usual confident demeanor crumbling under the relentless logic and unexpected depth of Michael's arguments. He stammered, fumbled with his notes, and his objections were now weak, easily dismissed by the young man who had once been nothing more than a figure of ridicule. The balance of power in the courtroom had demonstrably shifted. Michael, sensing the change, pressed on, his voice gaining a subtle edge of triumphant conviction. He brought forth a final, devastating piece of evidence, an obscure clause in the original deed for the bakery's land, a clause that explicitly protected small, family-owned businesses from corporate acquisition under specific conditions. It was a detail so minute, so deeply buried in historical records, that it had eluded even the most experienced legal minds on the corporation's team. He presented it not with arrogance, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had unearthed a hidden truth. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the implications became clear. Mrs. Petrova, tears streaming down her face, looked at Michael as if he were an angel sent from above. Judge Caldwell picked up the document Michael had presented, his eyes scanning the faded ink with an intensity that suggested he was seeing it for the first time. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, punctuated only by the rapid clicks of the judge's pen as he made a few notes. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Mrs. Petrova, then settling firmly on Michael. There was a profound stillness in his expression, a contemplative quiet that had replaced all trace of his earlier disdain. It was the look of a man who had been profoundly challenged, and in that challenge had perhaps even found a new understanding of justice. He then cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the hushed room, and a decision, heavy with consequence, hung in the air. Judge Caldwell finally broke the profound silence, his voice devoid of any previous mockery, now resonating with a newfound gravity. "Mr. Michael," he began, his gaze unwavering, "this court finds itself significantly impressed by the meticulous research and the exceptional legal argumentation you have presented today." The words were delivered with a measured respect, a stark contrast to his initial dismissal. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his face now a mask of barely concealed defeat. The judge then turned his attention to the corporation's legal team, his expression hardening. "And as for the defense," he continued, "your attempt to dismiss this case, and indeed this young man, has been profoundly short-sighted. The evidence presented by Mr. Michael regarding the original deed and its protective clauses is not only compelling, but, frankly, unimpeachable." A palpable wave of relief washed over Mrs. Petrova, her shoulders slumping as tears of gratitude welled in her eyes. The spectators, initially captivated by the drama, now murmured with a mixture of awe and vindication. They had come to see a boy humiliated, but they were leaving having witnessed a triumph of intellect and human spirit. The judge, before delivering his final verdict, paused, his eyes returning to Michael. "I must admit, Mr. Michael," he said, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice, "your command of such complex legal history and your ability to articulate these points with such clarity is truly remarkable for someone of your apparent age and experience. Where did you acquire such profound expertise?" The question hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary performance they had just witnessed. Michael met the judge's gaze, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. The quiet, unassuming facade he had worn at the beginning of the trial seemed to melt away, revealing a sharper, more confident presence. It was a transformation that hinted at a deeper story, a journey of struggle and perseverance that had forged this young man into the formidable attorney standing before them. The judge, the prosecutor, and every person in the gallery leaned forward, eager for the revelation, for the answer to the question that had been building in their minds throughout the proceedings. Michael held the judge's gaze, a quiet triumph shining in his eyes. The moment had arrived, the culmination of years of silent preparation and unwavering dedication. "Your Honor," he began, his voice now imbued with a gentle, yet undeniable, authority, "I appreciate your query. The truth is, my journey into law began many years ago. Not in a classroom, but in a similar courtroom to this one." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "When I was 15, my own family faced a grave injustice. We lost everything due to a legal loophole, exploited by a system that seemed to favor power over principle. I remember the judge presiding over that case. He was dismissive, much like you were with me today, Your Honor. He mocked our lack of resources, our inexperience." A ripple went through the courtroom. Mrs. Petrova looked at Michael with newfound understanding, her tears now mixed with a profound empathy for his personal history. Judge Caldwell's face, usually so composed, showed a flicker of discomfort, a dawning recognition of his own past behavior mirrored in Michael's words. "That day," Michael continued, his voice gaining a soft, resonant power, "I made a promise to myself. I swore I would never let another person, particularly someone vulnerable, suffer such an injustice without a fight. I devoured every legal book I could find, studied every case, and worked tirelessly, often late into the night, to understand the intricacies of the law. I didn't have the luxury of prestigious institutions or connections. My education came from a burning desire for justice and the silent vow I made to that 15-year-old boy." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the now silent courtroom, a silent acknowledgement of the transformation he had brought about, not just in this case, but in the perceptions of everyone present. "So, Your Honor," Michael concluded, his voice unwavering, "while I may appear young, I am indeed a fully qualified attorney, having passed the bar examination last year with honors. I chose to intern at the pro bono clinic, specifically to seek out cases like Mrs. Petrova's, because I believe true justice isn't found in wealth or influence, but in standing up for those who have neither." Judge Caldwell stared at Michael, his earlier disdain completely obliterated, replaced by a profound sense of awe and, perhaps, a touch of personal shame. The courtroom was utterly silent, every individual processing the stunning revelation. The teenager they had mocked was not just an attorney, but a genius attorney, forged in the fires of personal adversity. After a long, contemplative moment, Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, his voice now imbued with a newfound humility. Based on the undeniable evidence presented by Mr. Michael, he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "In his exceptional legal prowess, this court finds in favor of Mrs. Elena Petrova. Her bakery, a true community treasure, shall remain hers, free from all corporate claims." A cheer erupted from the gallery, a sound rarely heard in such a solemn setting. Justice, in its truest, most compelling form, had prevailed, delivered by the very person who had been so cruelly underestimated.